Hello, my name is Daniel Rigmaiden. Today I'm giving a presentation on the history and security implications of sensitive government cell phone surveillance equipment sold on secondary consumer markets such as eBay. This presentation is for the No for One Security Conference on October 15th to 16th, 2025. So first, I'm going to give some background on who I am. I'm an electronic surveillance consultant with an emphasis on law enforcement use of cell phone tracking equipment and techniques. I've been a consultant and defense expert for criminal defense attorneys in state and federal cases where cell phone tracking was used during an underlying criminal investigation. I've been a consultant for the American Civil Liberties Union on matters of government cell phone tracking, and that's in support of the ACLU's efforts to shape public policy, laws, court opinions in favor of the Fourth Amendment privacy rights when it comes to cell phone tracking. And I got my start because in 2008, I was indicted for federal tax return fraud after the FBI used a secret cell phone surveillance device called a cell site simulator, and it's also referred to as a StingRay. And it was used to locate me inside my apartment in California. This was after they had put in a lot of effort to locate me and identify me based on uh, the tax return fraud that they were investigating, and they just weren't able to find out who I was or where I was. So they ended up resorting to using a cell site simulator, and their entire prosecution depended on the cell phone tracking and location evidence that they collected using the cell site simulator. And into my defense, I eventually started representing myself. So I acted as my own defense attorney. Um, and I wrote all my own motions and I presented my own arguments in court. And I'll get into a little bit of that a bit later on. But first, I want to um, just give some more details on exactly what a cell site simulator is. So it's a miniature mobile cell tower that's operated by law enforcement, and it can also be operated by other actors. Um, can be foreign governments operated it in other countries where they want to do spying, or hackers could be using them, or fraudsters. It really could just be anybody, but they're primarily used by law enforcement to conduct investigations when they're either trying to find somebody, or if they're trying to find someone that they've been investigating that they need to arrest, or in other cases, if there's a missing person or a natural disaster where somebody is lost and they need to find them, and they'll use them in that case as well. But basically, how it works is it broadcasts a cellular network separate from any legitimate service provider network, and it forces all the compatible cell phones and other mobile devices within range of the cell site simulator to connect to it. And then once those devices are connected, the cell site simulator can perform electronic surveillance on any device that's connected to it. And there's three primary types of electronic surveillance that a cell site simulator will conduct. And the first one is to just simply identify a mobile device. So every cell phone has ID numbers that identify both the hardware of the phone and also the SIM card, which is used to provide service to the phone. Um, so a cell site simulator can force devices to connect and then send it certain uh, messages over the air that compels the mobile device to respond by revealing its serial numbers. The IMSI, IMEI, they have different names depending on what cellular protocol is in use. And the reason why that's done is they can figure out based on the IMSI at least what service provider the phone is under, and then they could subpoena the service provider to get the name of the person who uses the phone. Or if they already know the name of the person who uses the phone, then they'll subpoena the service provider to get the IMSI, and then they can conduct some kind of surveillance operation to locate the phone, uh, which comes into the next uh, use of this surveillance equipment, and it's to measure the radio signals to and from a mobile device to calculate the device's location. So once a device is identified, if law enforcement wants to locate the device, they'll maintain the connection to the device. So the cell site simulator has the fake cell network, and the phone is connected to it, and then they'll continue to they'll continue to send signals to the device, prompting it to send signals back, and then they can measure those signals to find out where the device is located. And there's different techniques to do that. I'll get into some of those in a minute. But that's really the primary function of the cell site simulators that are sold to law enforcement and the U.S. military. And then there's a third function of cell site simulators, and that's to intercept communications content received by the device. So normally, most of the time, when the device connects to the fake cell network through the cell site simulator, there's no service. It just, if the person tries to use the phone while that's happening, it's going to get, that that the call isn't going to connect, or if they try to access the internet, that's not going to work. Um, but in some cases, these devices can be configured to act as a man in the middle, and they'll conduct what's called a downgrade attack. So if you're on 4G, they'll tell your phone that the 4G network isn't available, and then it'll broadcast a 2G network, and then the phone will connect to that. And even though there aren't many 2G networks around in the world anymore, most phones are still able to connect to those networks and negotiate a connection from a 2G network. So it is still possible to use this equipment to conduct man-in-the-middle attacks, and there's certain vulnerabilities in 2G network where you can actually provide service to the phone, and if it makes a call, you can forward it through some other connection to a legitimate network. You can definitely get the text messages and the phone calls under that scenario, but it's rare. I mean, law enforcement has purchased equipment to do that, but um, I've never seen anything in any court records. They've actually used it for that purpose. It's just so much easier just to get a wiretap through the cell phone company and get the communications content that way. So primarily, the two ways that this equipment is used is to identify a device, and then once it's identified, to submit signals to the device, and then get signals back and measure those signals in order to locate the device. So these are examples of cell site simulators. Most of these are made by L3 Harris. At the time, they were Harris Corporation. I think all of these devices have been discontinued, but they're certainly still making them and selling them. It's just getting more difficult to figure out which ones they're selling today and their new capabilities, because they've kind of wised up as far as leaking that information accidentally to the public record. But these are 5 examples. The one in the bottom center is by DRT Inc. And that particular model, 1183C, is probably the most sophisticated one that I've found. And that's one of the ones that's able to collect communications content. But again, that device was out in an era when I think 3G was just coming onto the scene. So in order to do that on the later generations of cellular networks, it's going to be a lot more difficult, if not impossible, without doing a downgrade attack at least. So in addition, I should go back to this for a moment. So what's in these devices are basically software-defined radios, and they're responsible for sending the signals and receiving the signals when they're faking a cellular network for the devices to connect to. And you can see in the pictures, they have various ports for connecting antennas and power supplies and controllers. And it's just basically identical to the equipment you would get for a normal cell tower. It's just miniaturized, and it can't support as many connections, and it isn't going to be as powerful. And then in addition to the base station, which was in the last slide, you need to connect an antenna to the device. And typically, they're going to use direction finding antennas, because again, the most common use for these is to locate cell phones if they're trying to find a suspect or a missing person. So in order to do that, they need to connect some sophisticated antennas that are able to measure the signals and get a direction of arrival. So these are 3 examples of antennas used to do that. There is the L3 Harris Amberjack phased array antenna, and I'll talk more about that a bit later in the presentation. And then on the bottom, it's the DRT Inc. Direction finding antenna, and that isn't a phased array antenna. It just uses multiple antenna elements to calculate angle of arrival through a certain by using a certain equation. And then on the right is a Yagi antenna by L3Harris, and that's just a basic directional antenna that most people have heard of. And you can see it has a handle on it. So obviously someone's going to hold that and point it in the direction. They'll just point it around until the cell site simulator software tells them that they're pointed it in the direction of the phone that they're looking for. And then they can continue forward towards that location and continue to use it to try to pinpoint the location. But um, every cell site simulator is going to obviously need some type of antenna, and typically it's going to be a directional antenna, unless maybe they're just collecting the serial numbers from the phone and not doing a location operation. Then they wouldn't need a directional antenna if that's their primary purpose. In addition to the antenna, you also need some type of controller, and typically it's a laptop or a handheld controller shown in the picture here. These are actual screenshots from marketing material for the Harris cell site simulators. So these are the actual controllers that they provide with their equipment. And then obviously you're gonna need the software to load onto those controllers. And this is a screenshot of some cell site simulator controller software. This one's from DRT Inc. I couldn't find any good screenshots from Harris. They have some, but this was kind of more interesting. You can see that there's a map, and um, it's basically showing the location estimate calculations so that the operator of the cell site simulator can look at the map as they're moving around looking for the device, and basically read all of the graphics overlaid on the map, giving them an idea of where the device is and what direction they need to go in to continue to pinpoint the device. So these different ways that cell site simulators are deployed. Um, One way is stationary deployment for an event. You can imagine something like a protest, like at a government building, or maybe a high profile event, maybe um, like when members of the United Nations are meeting or something like that. They might set up, like the government might set up a cell site simulator in order to just log every device that's in the area. This as a preemptive tactic, like if there's some sort of attack or something like that, they could go back and look at those records and see who was in the area at the time when some event happened that they needed to investigate. And so that's the stationary deployment. So maybe it would be put up on top of a building. Um, and then the second deployment is carried on foot. So they might use one of the handheld controllers that I showed in the previous slide, and then some type of handheld antenna. It's usually after they're able to pinpoint the device more closely or more broadly. I mean, using like a road vehicle is the typical case. But when it's carried on foot, they might first pinpoint the location of a device down to an apartment complex or maybe a densely populated neighborhood. I need to walk through the streets just to kind of zero in further with a handheld device. So they make them that fit in backpacks and have a little handheld controller and handheld antenna. And it makes it very inconspicuous. Uh, there's also road vehicle mounted ones, and with those, that's most likely what law enforcement would start off with if they're trying to find somebody, especially if it's not like a search and rescue operation where someone's lost in the woods or something like that. If they're looking for a suspect in a city, they're going to load the equipment onto a vehicle and drive around with somebody on the laptop inside the vehicle and basically try to hone in on the device before deploying another device that's carried on foot. There's also aerial vehicle mounted ones. Those are typically more used by the military. And there's also aquatic vehicle mounted. So it could be put on a boat as well. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to phased array beamforming direction finding antennas because it becomes relevant later on in my presentation. And these examples, I'm not an expert on antennas, so these examples are quoted from a GitHub page by Sergio Mendez Vargo. It's called Phased Array Antennas with underscores between the words. He just kind of did an overview explaining how they work and what the differences are between phased array antennas and typical omnidirectional dipole antennas. So the primary difference, well, first of all, what you see in this slide is a diagram showing the radiation pattern of a dipole antenna. and basically it radiates in all directions using sort of a donut shape. And you can see that in the picture. And this is the type of antenna that you would typically see on lots of devices, like a Wi-Fi router or in a cell phone. It's just not directional. It's just designed to radiate in all directions in order to pick up whatever signal could be coming in. It's not used for locating a device or doing some type of point-to-point connection where you would need some type of directional antenna. So with these dipole antennas, very little can be done to change the radiation pattern. So it's always going to be in that sort of donut shape. And this is present for every antenna. If it's used single, if you just have one antenna element, that's going to be the case. And the difference between those dipole antennas and phased array antennas is that they can alleviate the constraint of being omnidirectional because they're constructed by arranging a number of individual antenna elements to form an array. And then software is used there's attenuators and phase shifters that can be used to control the magnitude and phase of the signal feeding each array. And those can be controlled digitally by software. So by controlling those elements, by controlling the signal feeding each antenna, it's possible to form a highly directional beam that can be used to locate and track radio transceivers such as cell phones. And another thing about phased array beamforming antennas is they can be electronically steered in the direction of the target without need for physically pointing the antenna. So earlier I showed you that handheld Yagi antenna, and with that antenna, the one that had the handle on it that I said that somebody would probably use on foot. So with that one, that's a directional antenna as well, but you have to physically point it in every direction. And the difference between a directional antenna of that nature and a phased array beamforming antenna is that you don't need to point the phased array antenna because it has antenna elements arranged in a 360-degree circle. And the software can basically form a beam automatically in any direction along that 360 degrees. So it makes it a lot easier to locate a phone because you can just put one of those antennas on top of a vehicle and drive around. And the software itself will just hone in on where it is and generate like a very strong signal and in just the direction of the device that they're looking for. And this is an example of that. So you can see in the diagram, um, there's a central lobe of a phased array antenna pointed in different directions along 180 degrees. This is from that GitHub page I was referencing earlier. And this is just showing you an example of how with the phased array antenna, the beam can be formed and pointed in any direction just by using the software. And you don't even need to operate it. You can just tell it to locate a certain signal and it's going to search for it on its own. And then it's going to create that specific beam pointed right at where the device is. And not only that, but it can also form multiple beams in multiple directions and locate multiple phones or multiple devices at the same time. So it's a very sophisticated antenna, and it's going to become more relevant later in the talk as to why I'm getting into the details on this. So before I go any further on the equipment, I wanted to talk a little bit about the U.S. Department of Justice, their efforts to conceal cell site simulator surveillance technology from the public. So a lot of people know about the technology now, but prior to September of 2011, the technology was not widely known. And the Department of Justice felt that disclosing the technology or any details on cell site simulators, or even admitting that they use them would allow the public to figure out ways to defeat the technology in law enforcement investigations. But as I mentioned earlier, the government used this technology to locate me when I got indicted for the tax return fraud. And as I was defending myself in that court case, I was able to compel the Department of Justice to finally admit to using the device and that they use it to locate me in my home and that it was a Fourth Amendment search, and then some minor details about how it operated, but they still weren't really revealing very much. And the first public article about the equipment, at least in the mainstream news, was on September 22nd, 2011 by the Wall Street Journal. And then even to this day, the United States government continues to conceal technical details on the technology, despite much of it being in the public domain. There's been lots of leaked user manuals at this point and marketing material. Um, so, they're concealing some things that we don't know, but they're also concealing the things that we do know. So it's kind of one of those, they neither confirm nor deny any of the details. And there really hasn't been much more disclosed since my case, except for in a few cases where a few additional details have come out about the equipment. Um, so with that in mind, I'm going to get into the heart of the presentation, which is a history of sensitive government electronic surveillance equipment sold on secondary consumer markets such as eBay. So L3 Harris Technologies, which is formerly Harris Corporation, they were the primary manufacturer and supplier of cell site simulator equipment for the government, the federal government, the military, local law enforcement, state law enforcement. They were pretty much the primary supplier from at least the late 1990s. And it started with a device called the Triggerfish. And that was the device, that was the cell site simulator that everybody was using before it was replaced by the StingRay. So it started in the early, or I'm sorry, it started in the late 1990s. And then it was all the way up until 2020 with the Rayfish line of Harris cell site simulator equipment. And then finally in June of 2020, L3 Harris, they stopped supplying local law enforcement with the equipment, but they did continue to supply federal law enforcement and the US military. But all of the old brand names like StingRay and Kingfish and the other ones that I showed you in the pictures at the beginning of the presentation, those have all been discontinued. And they're selling different equipment now, and I think they're not even really giving it names, or if they are giving it names, it's not really been released in any public record. Before, you could go to the United States Trademark Office website, and L3 Harris was like trademarking the names of all this equipment and uploading data sheets and all kinds of information that you could download and learn about it. But I guess they've learned since then, and they're not doing that anymore. In addition to that, even a lot of purchase records by the federal government and military are not being as detailed. They used to kind of explain what they were getting, and now it's just more like generic radio equipment from Harris. But it's pretty obvious, like what that radio equipment is, because a lot of the purchasing details mirror what they used to get back when they would identify it. And there are still some purchasing records where it is identified up until recently, within maybe like the last 5 years or something like that. Um, but anyways, numerous pieces of this equipment, which the government says is sensitive, it's been sold to the general public on eBay beginning as early as 2012. So that's over the last 13 years that this equipment has been on eBay for the general public to buy, and the whole time the government claiming that it's sensitive surveillance equipment. And I'm going to get into some examples of that. So here's the first one. This is the Harris Triggerfish cell site simulator with 6 receivers. So those are going to be the 6 software-defined radios. And this was sold on eBay on September 21st, 2012 for $495, which is an amazing deal, I would say. Whoever got this back then definitely got a nice piece of history for a good price, and maybe even something that's still usable, even though it's pretty old. Um, so that's the first example. And just to give a reference, this is in 2012 when this was on eBay on public auction, and this is the exact same time when in my case, when the government was prosecuting me for tax refund fraud, where they used the StingRay, which is very similar to the Triggerfish. They used that cell site simulator to locate me inside my home. And when I tried to challenge that use of technology based on a Fourth Amendment violation, that's when they started to claim, oh, the technology is sensitive. We can't give it to you. If we give it to you, people are going to defeat the technology. And during that whole time that they were making those claims, that Triggerfish that I showed you on the last slide was on eBay for $495. So it's kind of ridiculous that the government would make that claim while this was on eBay. I'm not sure if they knew it was on there. They probably didn't. They probably would have done something to get it off. I certainly didn't know it was on there. I wish I would have thought at the time to do an eBay search for Harris equipment. I never thought that eBay would but eBay would be selling this equipment back when the government is claiming that it's so sensitive. I mean, the government was flying in people from FBI headquarters to Arizona, where my court case was, to basically testify and say that they can't reveal this technology because it's so top secret that if they do reveal it, then it's going to have all these negative consequences for not only law enforcement but also national security. I mean, they were making every argument they possibly could to not give me this technology. While the whole time, here it is on eBay for $495, and somebody actually bought this at the time. And I wish I would have bought it because I could have gone to one of my court hearings and brought that equipment into the courtroom and put it down on the table and said, well, look, judge, they're saying it's sensitive, but I've got it right here in front of me. So how sensitive could it possibly be when I can buy this on eBay for $495? But anyway, this is a quote, a direct quote from one of the filings that the government submitted to the court, claiming that they couldn't reveal the technology to me, even though it was being sold on eBay at the time, which nobody knew, but it's just kind of ironic in hindsight. But anyways, the government said, the United States is concerned that disclosure of privileged information, which is a cell site simulator technology, would be harmful to the public interest and that it could diminish the future value of important investigative techniques and allow criminals to devise countermeasures to evade detection. So that's what they were claiming at the time. So that is the first piece of equipment. The second piece of equipment that I've logged over the years was this Amberjack X phased array beamforming antenna, which is that highly sophisticated antenna that I was describing earlier. And this was this was listed on eBay for $18,999. And that sounds like a lot, but that was probably a discounted price at the time because these are very expensive to make. I mean, they have hundreds of antenna elements in them that need to be controlled digitally all at the same time. It's very sophisticated. But anyways, this sat on eBay for a while, and then the seller ended it early on January 15th, 2018, without any buyer, which doesn't surprise me because that is very expensive. And the next example is that Harris quad band Gaggy, which is that handheld directional antenna. So that's kind of similar to, well, it isn't similar to a phased array directional beamforming directional antenna, but it does serve the same purpose. It's just much less sophisticated, where you have to manually hold it and point it in the direction of where you think the cell phone is. So this is listed on eBay for $199, and the last time I checked, it's still for sale. One has been sold and two available. And this isn't really a very sensitive piece of equipment. This is just a standard antenna. I mean, I guess it is a quad band, so it covers multiple bands, but you can get something like this on the commercial market. So well, for $200, it's probably a good deal if you're looking for something like that. I don't know if you're going to get much cheaper than that elsewhere under a different generic brand. But anyways, this is still on there. This is surveillance equipment still on eBay right now that anybody can buy. And then the fourth one, and this is the most alarming one, and this is really the central piece to my presentation. This is the Harris Amberjack W phased array beamforming direction finding antenna, and it's listed on eBay for $3,999.99. And it's still for sale as of October 6, 2025. And the Amberjack W is more sophisticated than that other Amberjack that I showed you a minute ago. It has the same technology, but this one actually covers more cellular frequencies. So this one will cover all the way up to 3G. So that's useful. And this one is still for sale as well. Anybody can buy it. Not sure if anybody will. That's probably a fairly good price, but we'll have to see. And this is the fifth one, and this is an actual StingRay cell site simulator. This was listed on eBay for $100,000 as early as April 19, 2024. It's pretty recently, and it was ended early, and presumably it was ended by eBay. I don't know for sure. I'm going off of information in a news article, but as you can see in the picture, it's pretty complete. It has the manual, all the wires, the device itself, the case. This one actually hit X. People were talking about it on X, and some journalists started looking into it. And according to A July 1st, 2024 article on TechDirt. eBay took down the auction after a journalist for 404 Media contacted eBay, probably asking for a quote or something like that. And it turns out eBay does have a policy against selling electronic surveillance equipment, just in general. And it says most electronic equipment used to transmit or receive signals or for surveillance is not allowed. So that's their general policy about it. So I guess after the journalists made the inquiry, eBay decided to take the auction down. So that's what ended up with that one. So those are the 5 examples. Two of them currently still listed on eBay. You can go look those up yourself if you're interested, and just kind of seeing how those auctions operate. Um, so, anyways, it's kind of interesting that eBay would take down the StingRay cell site simulator auction, but not the Harris Amberjack phased array beamforming direction finding antenna auction. The reason why it's interesting is because those beamforming antennas are far more sophisticated and have far more sensitive technology in them than any Harris cell site simulator, whether old or new or however you want to classify them. And this is because any member of the public can buy a software-defined radio, which is the basically the same transceiver that you're going to find in those commercial cell site simulators. You can buy those online, and then you can download open source base station software, and then use a laptop, and then you can basically just operate your own cell site with that transmits and receives. It basically becomes a cell site simulator. The only thing that's missing is the surveillance capability, but with some basic Python scripts, you can log whatever you want. You can log the serial numbers of the devices. You can measure the signal power. You can time the signals. You can do location stuff. You can get one of those. You can get that $200 Harris direction finding antenna, the Yagi one, the cheap one on eBay, and at least do some rudimentary direction finding with that. So the cell site simulator itself really isn't that sensitive, and I see why eBay took it down because it's a policy violation, but it's interesting that they're not taking down the phased array beamforming antennas, which are far more sensitive, which I'll describe in a minute. But here are some below here. There's 3 examples of open source base station software for 4G and 3G. So, you can get this software pretty easily and configure it yourself. There's countless articles and blog posts and research papers that you can download and read. There's videos on YouTube explaining how to do it. It's not a difficult thing. Now, in contrast, the phased array beamforming antennas like the Harris Amberjack, which is being sold in that eBay auction right now for $3,999, those types of phased array antennas, or any type of phased array antenna for that matter, are not generally sold on consumer hobbyist markets in the way you can get a software-defined radio. There's no products on Amazon in the realm of phased array beamforming antennas other than some textbooks that cost $100 that just explain the technology. That gives you a little bit of an idea of how unknown or unstudied the technology is in the hobby space. There's no products on Google search under the shopping tab when you search for these antennas. And other than the previously noted Amberjack W that's being sold on eBay right now for the $3,999, there's currently only 2 other additional phased array antenna products on eBay, but they're primitive and they're not for mobile cellular networks. So it kind of just goes to show how much more sensitive the direction finding antennas are, especially this particular type, than the actual cell site simulators that are getting taken off of eBay. So phased array beamforming antennas are difficult to build. Most people don't know much about them unless you work in that field. You're an engineer who develops those antennas for somebody. Um, there are some GitHub projects for phased array antennas, and I quoted from one earlier when I was describing the technology, but most are theoretical demonstrations as opposed to providing some kind of actual software that's designed to operate some type of antenna, phased array, beamforming antenna hardware itself. So that's a good comparison where you can go onto GitHub and get cell site simulator software, or it maybe not particularly under that category, but you can definitely get it as just generic base station software. If you want to just operate your own private cell site, that software is available. Um, one exception, though, for the beamforming antennas on GitHub is a project called Pluto Beamformer by John Kraft. And that actually does include some Python scripts for a proof of concept to antenna element phased array antenna that uses a Pluto SDR, which is a particular off-the-shelf software-defined radio. But because with that project, it only uses two antenna elements, where for a sophisticated phased array beamforming antenna, you could have hundreds of elements, or maybe even thousands. I'm not an expert on these antennas. That just goes to show how the entry point for this type of information. It's not easy to find information on these antennas unless you want to buy one of those $100 textbooks on Amazon. But anyways, the beam created by the Pluto beamformer, which is the GitHub project I just mentioned, it can't be electronically steered around a 360-degree radius, or can it achieve a high gain narrow beam width for precise direction finding. So that's one of the differences between um, what level they've gotten to in the hobby space versus like what level they've gotten to when you get to these enterprise level beamforming antennas like the Harris Amberjack that can send a narrow, very high power beam in any 360-degree direction with multiple beams at the same time, tracking multiple phones, all using software without the user having to really intervene. Um, but anyways, this GitHub project, the Pluto beamformer, it is a good starting point for hobbyists wishing to build a more sophisticated phased array antenna, utilizing more antenna elements. And that's really what you need to do. You need to have as many antenna elements as you can in order to um, be able to create that high gain beam. And if you want to be able to do 360-degree radius, you need to arrange those in a certain way, or use different clusters of antenna elements, so you have multiple beam forming sets that are kind of working together. It's very sophisticated, very complicated, hard to do. This is a screenshot from the Pluto beamformer proof of concept project. You can see he's just using two antennas there sitting on the table, and he's just kind of running a test to see how well his two element beam former can locate the direction of something. So the Harris Amberjack W, which is again the device that's on eBay for sale right now for $3,999. It's a technologically advanced enterprise level phased array direction finding antenna system capable of tracking and locating mobile phone users and base stations, supporting frequency bands covering 2G and 3G mobile networks. So L3Harris likely stopped selling the Amberjack W around November 3rd of 2023, because that's the date that they let the trademark registration lapse. So we know that they're likely not selling it after that, and they stopped selling it sometime before that, sometime between that date, November 3rd, 2023, and then the last date that they updated their trademark stuff, which basically you need to file something every year to keep it active. But even with that said, the Amberjack W is not obsolete, because most cell phones still support 2G and 3G bands and protocols, even if most modern networks only support 4G and 5G bands and protocols. So the networks in the US are all 4G now. You're not going to find a 3G, definitely not a 2G. You might find some of those older networks still operating in other countries that just haven't upgraded yet. But um, the phones themselves, the phone hardware still supports 2G and 3G. So unless you do something to the phone to make it so that it just ignores those bands, um, the phone is still going to be susceptible to this Amberjack W antenna that supports 2G and 3G, but not 4G and 5G. Um, so the Amberjack W, it can be electronically steered around a 360-degree radius, and pointing a high gain, narrow propagation beam for precise direction finding. And this is precise enough to be used by United States law enforcement based for both locating suspects of crimes and for search and rescue operations. And it's also precise enough to be used by the United States military. So various branches of the United States military have purchased the Amberjack W phased array antenna, the one that's still for sale on eBay right now. For example, the U.S. Army purchased that particular Amberjack equipment on August 30th, 2012. And there's a reference at the end in the end notes, and these are some screenshots of the purchase record. So yeah, this is they bought it in combination with the StingRay 2 and software and an amplifier and some other components. So that's one of the older references that I found of the purchase in 2012. And then here is a more recent purchase. This is the Army purchased the Crossbow, which is another Harris cell site simulator, and this was on June 19, 2018. And even though the Amberjack isn't listed in this purchase, the Crossbow is compatible with the Harris Amberjack. So with the Crossbow cell site simulator, if the Army still has the Amberjack, they can plug that into the Crossbow and still track phones on 3G. And they can even, and again, if that works on modern cell phones, because if you have a 4G phone or 5G phone, it still supports 3G. And the way that the Harris cell site simulator software works is it can tell the phone to downgrade to 3G. So once it establishes a 4G connection with the phone, it will say, okay, well, now that you're connected, we're going to use 3G now. And basically the phone says, okay, well, I'll use 3G. And at that point, they can use the Amberjack W direction finding antenna in order to find the phone. So the U.S. military has a history of using cell phone location information on the battlefield to locate enemy targets. And the earliest reference I could find was 2001. I think this is probably a pretty good reference. Basically in 2001, Washington Post reported, well, they reported later, but they were reporting on something that happened in 2001, which kind of reads like it was the first time the military realized that they could use cell phone location information on the battlefield in order to locate targets. So this was a case where the NSA had some type of cell phone tracking equipment in the air, and there was some special operations unit on the ground that was looking for someone, and they were trying to get the NSA to look up the phone and tell them like where it was. So that was the first reference I could find, and that was in 2001. So after that, according to the previous slides, in 2012, they're well on their way of purchasing millions and millions and millions of dollars of this equipment. All different branches of the military have purchased this equipment and using it on the battlefield. So it's probable that the Amberjack is still being used by the United States military in combat operations. Again, the trademark was only canceled 2 years ago, and just because it only supports 3G and not 4G, that's not a limiting factor because you can tell the phone to downgrade to 3G just for the location operation aspect of it. So the equipment isn't obsolete. So it could still be used, and I think that it probably would be. I mean, usually the U.S. military uses equipment until, until it's like falling apart or whatever. So I would think that they're still using this, especially because it still works. I'm sure somebody there would say, hey, you know what, this equipment still works. We can still use this. It may not be given to the top tier, but it's still something that they could keep around and use. Certain military units could still utilize that. And I think that they probably are, considering it's only been 2 years since it appears it's only been 2 years since Harris stopped selling it. So it's a national security threat to allow public consumer level sales of the Harris Amberjack phased array beamforming antenna on eBay, because enemies of the United States can purchase the Amberjack from those public eBay auctions for the purpose of reverse engineering the technology. And that serves various purposes. For one thing, they could determine the precision of the Amberjack. They could test it in different terrain conditions to see like how well they could be found in certain hiding spots. They could develop ways to thwart the military's use of the Amberjack, just in general. I mean, they could use the antenna themselves to to see how maybe they could configure their cell phones to not work when the military is using the amberjack, or maybe there's some other way. I mean, who knows? You just got to take it apart and start reverse engineering stuff. Who knows what you could find on something like that? You could also develop ways to detect use of the amberjack. So maybe it has a certain signature, and they can develop their own antennas that basically track and detect the amberjack while the amberjack is trying to track and detect them. And they could also study the amberjack technology to make assumptions on unknown, newer L3 Harris direction finding antenna technology. So let's just say the military isn't using the amberjack W anymore because it's only goes up to 3G. Let's just assume that that's true. Harris is still making this equipment and selling it to the military. I've seen the purchase records. So it it's reasonable to assume that any new phased array beamforming antenna is going to be an extension of whatever they've developed in the past. I mean, they're not going to just erase everything and start over. So just because something's old and it's been upgraded by a manufacturer, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any use when it comes to reverse engineering. So that brings me to the next part of the presentation is who is buying this equipment. I mean, if it's a national security threat to have it on eBay, and some of the auctions are obviously finishing and the equipment is being sold. So who is buying it? Well, I thought of asking the eBay sellers. So whenever something would sell, I would send them a message and I would ask them, "Hey, who bought this equipment?" And I would also ask them um, where the equipment came from. But in this exchange with an eBay seller, um, I asked exactly that, and he responded, or she, with sounds like a collector in the Netherlands. So that just goes to show the equipment is being purchased on eBay in the US and then shipped out of the US where it falls into the hands of who knows who. And shipment of military grade surveillance equipment outside of the United States, this could be a violation of 22 USC section 2778 of the Arms Export Control Act and Executive Order 13637. And that section of the act is implemented by the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, which is the general reference that usually people talk about when it comes to exporting this equipment. Basically, what it means is says the government classifies certain products sold in the United States, and they say it's a felony if anyone exports this equipment outside of the United States because it's used by the military or some other national security aspect of the government. So they don't want it leaving the US. And if anybody ships that out of the US, they can get in a lot of trouble. And obviously, it is being shipped out of the US. So you can assume what you will about that. And how does Harris cell site simulator surveillance equipment end up for sale on eBay? Well, that's another question that I ask usually when I see something sell, and this, or even when something is just listed. And this is for the this is the seller who's selling that Amberjack X, right, or that Amberjack W right now, and also he's selling that handheld directional Harris antenna. And in response to my question, he's told me state surplus property and federal property program. So whatever that means, he's getting it from state and federal. It looks like, so not from military surplus. And that's really a good argument to, or good support for the argument that surveillance equipment that's provided to the United States military, it really shouldn't be provided to local and federal law enforcement. They should have completely different classes of equipment being used because in this case, obviously, it's the same equipment and now it's trickled down from these surplus channels onto eBay and people can get it while it's potentially still being used by the US military on the battlefield. And I already went over um, the security implications of that scenario. So the eBay policy that prohibits the sale of cell site simulators, it should be applied also to the sale of the phased array beamforming direction finding antennas, like the Amberjack W that's for sale on eBay right now. And the reason for that is the policy, which I referenced earlier. It says most electronic equipment used to transmit or receive signals or for surveillance is not allowed. And a phased array antenna, such as the Amberjack W, it definitely meets the definition of the eBay policy on electronic equipment, considering it receives signals and is generally for surveillance. So some of you might be thinking, well, I don't deal in surveillance equipment. So how does this apply to me? But these lessons, they definitely carry over from just sensitive government cell phone surveillance equipment to lots of other stuff. I mean, as a security or cyber security professional, your companies or your clients' sensitive and proprietary electronic equipment could definitely end up on eBay or other secondary consumer markets just the same as this Harris cell phone tracking equipment. One example, in 2018, a security researcher at Symantec purchased electronic voting machines on eBay for the purpose of reverse engineering them to identify security vulnerabilities. So that's one example of equipment that trickles down to eBay that whoever manufactured it should probably not let that happen. And then examples of products that should have strict lifecycle control guidelines, in addition to surveillance equipment and obviously voting machines. If you're a voting machine manufacturer and you don't want people, taking them apart, um, industrial control system components used in critical infrastructure. So you can think of one example is like electronic valves and water treatment facilities. And if somebody wanted to um, hack into one of those valves, it would probably help them in order to find one somewhere. And if it's proprietary, maybe there's like some kind of control on who's able to buy them. Um, eBay might be a good place to look for those. Imagine if you know s- imagine if somebody got one of those and then reverse engineered it and changed the firmware on it or did something to make it easier to get into it, and then did some type of supply chain attack where they switch it out with a new one being shipped to a new customer, and they end up getting the one that was altered. There's lots of different scenarios. You can use your imagination, but basically anything that's sensitive like that should definitely have some life cycle control so that they don't end up on eBay eventually. Also, any product containing custom design integrated circuits. You can think of ASICs or FPGAs, anything that's done custom for a client. Um, you definitely don't want those ended up on eBay. Someone attacking that client could wait for those and somehow trace them back and know that they came from a particular target, and then now they have access to all that custom design integrated circuitry, and also any product containing proprietary firmware. You can think of like hardware security modules, anything that has firmware that can be extracted, reverse engineered, studied for vulnerabilities, cloned, etc. I'm sure you get the idea. Uh, so, how do you avoid these types of security blunders that result in sensitive equipment ending up on markets like eBay? Well, you need to establish and put into practice strict lifecycle guidelines for all products containing technology that you want to conceal from the general public. So I know concealment isn't the best security measure, but in a situation like this, it's really pretty much all you have. You just kind of have to try to control your products after they leave. So one way to do that is you can legally and contractually bind all purchasers of those sensitive products to the lifecycle guidelines that you put in place. So you can have one of you can have your customers who buy a certain product agree that at the end of its life they have to return it to you, and if they don't, there could be some type of penalty. I mean, there's lots of different creative ways to um, compel people to not just send off their equipment to some auction when they file for bankruptcy, or when they're cleaning out some old room of old equipment and they just want to try to liquidate it. I mean, you can do certain things in order to do that, in order to prevent that. Um, and then you also have to monitor the product exposure and enforce the life cycle guidelines. So you want to try to monitor markets like eBay to see if your equipment ends up on there. And they have different APIs that you can use to do that. It's not too difficult. Um, and most importantly, you should employ the services of a technologist to help translate between the engineers and the policymakers or attorneys at your organization. And it goes to show that people really don't do this. I mean, they should. I mean, take a look at eBay with their policy against surveillance equipment, but for whatever reason, they've completely missed the fact that that particular Harris phased array antenna is even more sensitive than the equipment that they're pulling off of eBay, that meets the surveillance policy. So if eBay would hire somebody who was good at translating between engineering concepts and policy concepts, then maybe they wouldn't make those mistakes. And the same lesson applies to your organization. You can have lots of smart engineers and lots of smart policymakers and attorneys, but it's difficult for those two groups to communicate with each other. So it's good to find somebody who's able to help mediate between them and uh, kind of figure out what the other side is missing. Because a technologist has um, some engineering skills and some policy skills. He's not the best engineer, he's not the best policymaker, but he knows enough of both sides, and he's very good at communicating between the two sides in order to make sure that they don't make any mistakes. So I think it's very important to do. And if you do need help with your um, life cycle guidelines and different strategies to employ to keep your products from trickling down to these secondary markets, you can contact me. Don't end up like Harris and the U.S. military and the federal government and eBay. You know, you want to definitely avoid these types of blunders. I mean, this one is a national security threat, but for you, it might be, you know, a competitor gets the edge. They take apart some of your proprietary equipment and copy it, or somebody uses it for as a vector for an attack on one of your clients. So those are certainly situations you want to avoid. So if you need help avoiding those situations, you can reach out to me, and I'd be happy to help you. You can reach me at danielrigmaiden.com, and various endnotes for my presentation at the end here that you can check out. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.